Thank you for joining tonight's virtual forum event hosted by the Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy, known to many of you as GU Politics. My name is Mateo Caulfield, and I'm a sophomore in the college studying government and classics. Throughout my time at Georgetown, I've had the opportunity to involve myself with GU Politics through the Georgetown Bipartisan Coalition. We are a community of Republicans, Democrats, and independents dedicated to encouraging civility and open discussion between students of all backgrounds and ideologies. We do this by hosting policy roundtables, formal debates between political clubs, and promoting bipartisan discussion, such as this event tonight. And so I am pleased to introduce our guests, Antonia Ferrier, former staff director of the Senate Republican Communications Center under Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, and currently Chief Strategy and Communications Officer for CCGN Group. Brian Fallon, former press secretary for Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and currently Executive Director of Demand Justice. Ron Bonjean, formerly the lead spokesman for leadership in both the U.S. House and Senate and the chief communication strategist during Justice Neil Gorsuch's nomination process. And lastly, Stephanie Cutter, deputy campaign manager for President Obama's 2012 campaign and head of the Constitutional Responsibility Project during Judge Merrick Garland's nomination process. Please join the conversation on social media using the hashtag GU Virtual Forum and by tagging GU Politics at GU Politics. Tonight's event will be moderated by GU Politics' Executive Director, Mo Alithi, who is going to kick us off.
Thanks so much, Mateo. Thanks for the great introduction. And thanks for all the work you guys do over at the Bipartisan Coalition and your commitment to bipartisan discourse and civil discourse. Hopefully we on this panel won't let you down tonight. Thanks everyone for tuning in, both here in the Zoom as well as those of you that are tuning in via social media for what is a pretty timely conversation about the Supreme Court battle that's ahead of us and what it means in the Senate, what it means for the court, what it means for the election. I couldn't be more thrilled with the panelists that we've got joining us, a couple of whom, Antonia and Ron, are former GU Politics fellows. Stephanie, who's a Georgetown Law alum, and Brian, who's a friend of the program. It's a great group, and these folks have been allies and adversaries for a long time, but they're all here because of their commitment to this kind of a conversation. The way it's going to work, for those of you that haven't been to one of our forum events, for the first half of the conversation, we're going to kind of talk amongst ourselves to set the stage, and then about halfway through, we're going to bring you in. If you've got questions, go down to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can start populating it with your questions now. At some point, someone from our team will let you know when your question's been picked, and then you will be brought on screen to ask your question. So as we say in the business, be camera ready, because we're going to make you famous. And then hopefully you'll get a chance to have a good conversation with the panelists as well. And so with that, let's get started. I kind of want to talk about this in three buckets. Sort of what's going on in the Senate and sort of the way both parties in the Senate are approaching the next couple of weeks. Then I want to talk a little bit about it from the perspective of the nominee and by extension, at least until the confirmation, the White House and sort of the strategy there. And then I want to talk a little bit about what this means for the election. So let's start with the Senate. And I want to begin with Antonia and Brian, if I could. Antonia, talk to us a little bit about how we got to where we are right now from the Senate Republican perspective and what the strategy is that you think Leader McConnell and his team are pursuing right now.
Sure. There are a lot of things to sort of consider. Let me just start with, there's obviously, when Justice Ginsburg passed away when she did, it's timing. And also I should just start out by saying, I may be a Republican as a woman, as an American. I just want to say we should all be very thankful for what she's done for this country. Just a quick sidebar on that. You know, I was talking to a friend of mine. She bought her house on Capitol Hill. The woman she bought it from needed to get, when she bought it in 1962, needed to get a man to co-sign her mortgage. Justice Ginsburg, before she joined the court, she was really instrumental in ensuring that women could go and do things like get a mortgage on her own. These are things that we do not comprehend today, but we need to honor her and her legacy for what she's done for all women. And I don't care what your partisan background is, we need to honor and respect a woman who's done so much for so many, and not just women, but sitting here as a woman, I just want to pay some respect to her. So, you know, she obviously is a lion in terms of what her work in her life. When she passed away is obviously very close to an election. The majority leader of the Senate, Senator McConnell, he put out a statement rather quickly, obviously honoring her legacy and her life, and said there will be a vote. Now, he didn't say how or when, but he starts very, very methodically with one step at a time. You know, a few things, that the court at 8 seats, and with a presidential election and the Senate up in when it is, that there really was only the time is now, that there was going to be so much pressure by so many people to try and act on a nomination that he said whether or not he can or cannot get this nominee through, he was going to move to a vote. Now, all the pieces had to be sort of figured out from there. Obviously, the president needed to select a nominee, but in the process, because of what happened with Judge Garland, and I'm sure Stephanie has much to say on that matter, when Justice Scalia had passed away, Senate Republicans had taken the position when President Obama was in office that they were not going to seat Judge Garland to the Supreme Court. And so with that in mind, Senate Republicans very much knew that many of their words would be thrown back at them, fully understood that. Senator McConnell has unwrapped that from his perspective. But I think it was just a very simple equation. Senate Republicans won 2 additional seats in 2018. They have the majority with 53 votes. They have a Republican in the president. He has the right to, as commander-in-chief, to nominate someone, and they were going to have a vote. Now, I don't think it was anyone's desire, obviously, for Justice Ginsburg to, number one, pass away, but the time, no one could control the time. The reality is just that given this window, the decision was made he made the decision to go forward. He got the votes, and when you have the votes, you move forward. The president nominated Judge Barrett, and we are going. The Judiciary Committee is announced its hearings, and you know, I would expect there will be a vote the week before the presidential election. Is this the optimum timing from everyone's perspective? No, but it's just the reality of where we are. And I would note one thing. I was watching television the week after Justice Ginsburg's death, and Harold Ford, a former Democratic congressman from Tennessee, remarked on television that if Democrats were in the same position with a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate in this situation, they would do the same thing. Now, I know that's ugly. I know it's not a pleasant thing, but that's just the reality. When you have power and the ability to do it, you do. Circumstances were different. Circumstances would be different, but this is just where we are. So there is a timeline locked in place with the votes locked in place that it will go through, the nomination will go through the committee. The Democrats in the Senate have been very clear that they are going to wage war. That is fine. They view this as a hostile act. This is politics. And this is, I hate to say that one of the best answers that the president gave last night, maybe one of his few good answers last night, was on the Supreme Court. So I would just argue this is how it is, and we're going forward. And I would expect that Democrats, like they did on the floor yesterday quite successfully, are going to make this as painful as they can, but knowing that at the end of the day, they have little power to really stop this nominee, who is a highly qualified woman from Notre Dame. And so there we have it.
So Brian, from the Senate Democrats' perspective, what are the options?
So the first thing that I think is on the minds of the Senate Democrats is just taking account of what an iconic figure is Ruth Bader Ginsburg was in the popular imagination. For progressives, she was every bit the figure in terms of stature and that Antonin Scalia was. And so if you look at the intensity that existed among conservatives in 2016 to carry out that blockade and hold that seat open, there's a similar level of intensity about wanting to do right by Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy. And I think that a lot of Senate Democrats want to be seen as mirroring that intensity and channeling those feelings that they are observing out in the country from not just diehard progressive activists, but I think a lot of, suburban women that will count as swing voters in this election, I think had a lot of sentiment, as Antonia just testified to. So I think that the first thing that Senate Democrats want to do is they want to put up every possible bit of fight that they can to show the country that they are doing their darndest and channel all that energy that exists out there. The second thing that I think that they're taking account of is the election. Before Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I think that Chuck Schumer felt pretty good about how things were looking in terms of the trajectory of the Senate races. And so to a certain extent, the idea of a Supreme Court vacancy right in the middle of an election just scrambles the calculations about, where do things stand. And I think that everybody felt like they had the Republican incumbents on the ropes on the handling of COVID and 200,000 deaths. But there's been a lot of internal and external polling in the first 10 days since she passed away. And I think that the Senate Democrats have basically come to the conclusion that the doing the right thing in their minds of trying to delay this past the election is aligned with their political goals of trying to win the election as well. I don't think that they perceive there to be any backlash potential with upholding the position that this should wait until after the election. Pretty much every public poll has shown that by a margin of somewhere between 10 and 20 points, the public thinks that this should wait till after the election. So you're seeing Senate challengers in even states where Trump is running ahead of Biden. You're seeing Democratic challengers in those Senate races feeling to stake out the same position as Chuck Schumer, that this should wait till after the election. So all of those things, I think, are dovetailing such that Democrats are going to try to pull out all the stops. And as Antonia says, their powers are limited. I think Chuck Schumer is going to try to use all the procedural tactics that are available to him, like invoking, arcane rules like the 2-hour rule to prevent committees from meeting for more than 2 hours without unanimous consent, perhaps forcing a quorum call and noting the absence of a quorum and forcing Mitch McConnell to bring 51 senators to the actual floor of the Senate in order to continue conducting business. You saw them last night use a procedural trick to bring up a cloture motion, which not a lot of people realize that anybody other than the floor, the majority leader can do, but they did do that last night. I think they're going to do that. Very well done.
Very well done.
It was clever. I don't think they're going to telegraph all that stuff. A lot of liberal activists would like Chuck Schumer to announce exactly what he's going to do on that front, and Chuck, I don't think, is going to telegraph it all because part of the success of it relies on the element of surprise. But I think they're going to do that, but at most that will allow them to delay things. It won't fundamentally allow them to stop it. And so at the end of the day, the best that the Senate Democrats and outside groups like mine can hope for is to keep this as unpopular a move as it is right now. And that will maximize the chances of perhaps putting some pause in the minds of Senate Republicans to at least delay this till after the election. If they're decided about doing this before the election, then by making it unpopular, we at least keep it as a liability for them come election time. And then in terms of what comes after, I think the more that this is viewed as illegitimate by the public, I think the more likely it makes it so that there's a political permission structure down the road for Democrats to talk about ideas about how we can reform the judicial branch of government in the long term to avoid these knockdown, drag out, all zero-sum standoffs that happen based on the randomness of circumstances of when Supreme Court justices either pass away or decide to retire. I don't think anybody thinks that the current system is working in terms of how we decide who sits on the court and how we confirm them.
I want to come back to both the election and the potential of Supreme Court reform in a few moments. But let me bring in both Stephanie and Ron. You both also are veterans of the Senate, and so feel free to weigh in on the Senate strategy of both parties. But you also both are uniquely positioned to speak about what's going on the other side of this equation, right? With the nominee, with Judge Barrett, and the White House. And so, maybe you could talk a little bit about what that process is like, how they're being prepared, how they're approaching interactions with the Senate, which is going to be admittedly somewhat one-sided as more and more Democrats say they're not even going to meet with her. Stephanie, why don't you kick off this part of the conversation?
So at this point, on the White House side, I was the Sherpa for Sonia Sotomayor as she went through her confirmation. They're doing two things. They're thinking about how they're going to prepare her for her hearings, but they are also setting her up to have individual meetings with senators. As per tradition, senators have private meetings with the nominee to ask whatever questions they have. It's typical that the nominees don't really answer any questions, so that's something that you practice too. I think what's different for this nominee, and it was also different for Garland, President Obama's last pick, who didn't get a hearing and didn't even get a meeting with Republicans because they refused to meet with him, is that Democrats right now, many of them are calling this an illegitimate nomination and refusing to meet with the nominee to make their point. Others believe that it's their duty to have these meetings and to show up at the hearing and ask tough questions. So the caucus is unanimous in thinking that this needs to be delayed after the election. But they are split in terms of how they are individually handling it for their senatorial duties. So in terms of preparing her, she's a law professor. She's not going to be hard to prepare. Sometimes sitting judges can be hard to prepare because it's been a long time since they've had to go through this type of mortarboarding and answering questions, and it's primarily been one-sided for them. But they're going through her record, her writings, her commentary, any interviews that she's done, her alliances, her memberships. We've seen that show up in the news already. And then applying them to, whatever accusations of bias that people are going to make in terms of her interpretation of the law. They know what the hot button issues are, anything having to do with Roe v. Wade, or the extensions of privacy out of the Fourth Amendment, anything having to do with the Commerce Clause, anything having to do with the Second Amendment, and obviously anything having to do with the election. And she, there was a report out today that she refused to recuse herself in her Senate questionnaire, because that is the first step. You have to return, once the nomination occurs, you have to return your Senate questionnaire to the Judiciary Committee that has a whole host of questions on it. And in that questionnaire, she refused to recuse herself.
On issues regarding the election.
Issues regarding the election. Should she be confirmed to the Supreme Court, if issues regarding the election come before her as a justice, she says that she will not recuse herself. So you can expect that to be a big issue at the hearing, particularly because President Trump is already pointing to the importance of this nominee because he expects the election results to go before the Supreme Court, and he wants a 6-3 advantage.
Ron, if you're helping her team at this point, what are you preparing for, and what are the pitfalls you're worried about?
Yeah, great question. There are only really two times that the nominee has a chance to speak for herself. One is when she's introduced by the president, which occurred recently, and then the second is the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. So what if I were on that team right now, what we'll be working on are a couple things. One is, of course, preparing her for the hearing. Part of it is, and Stephanie alluded to this, these judges are brilliant. They are extremely competent. They know their case law. They know where they stand. Our exercises are to refresh through the White House legal counsel and through assistance from the outside on a little bit of that case law, but more importantly, because everything, 30 plus days before an election is political, preparing for her to understand that she's going to be sitting before the committee for 3 to 4 days, 8 to 10 hours at a clip. I mean, of course, there'll be breaks, but you're under the hot lights. The first day is just open commentary opening statements from senators from both sides of the aisle. Then she'll go in the second day, undergo questioning. And our goal is to make sure that she's prepared, and frankly, to make sure that, you know, her answers portray her in a very solid light. Additionally, I think most lawyers who put a witness on the stand, she's on the stand, so to speak, are trying to make them as boring as possible, while as competent as possible. Meaning, Senate Democrats are more than likely going to try to get one of those Jack Nicholson from A Few Good Men moment, if you remember that movie, the you can't handle the truth moments, even flashes of that, to show that she might have some type of bias, to try to get under her skin in any way, shape, or form. Of course, very professionally. But in her, you know, her goal is to just answer the questions, you know, as truthfully as possible, not to get into hypotheticals. That's one thing that both sides can ask is, how do you feel about Roe v. Wade? Talk to us about healthcare, Obamacare. What would you do if you were on the bench? Most of the time, she's not going to be able to answer those questions. She's going to say that she's going to follow the law the way it is written. On Roe v. Wade, you know, Justice Gorsuch at the time said he was going to follow precedent. You know, that the law is follow the law as it currently stands. Our goal is to have her portray herself as a fair judge who would interpret the law the way it stands, as the originalist, as she says. So there's a lot that goes into that. It's not it's an exhausting procedure. This is what's so fascinating, is how fast this is going, because a normal process for a nominee would last, I don't know, Justice Gorsuch had 6 to 7 weeks to prepare for a Senate hearing. Additionally, Gorsuch was also meeting with senators at the same time. Barrett has to do both before October 12th, really, when she appears before the committee. That means there's lots of caffeine and lots of Gatorade, you know, that she's probably going to be drinking to get ready for this thing. However, again, she's brilliant. She's, you know, a very smart person. They're all smart on the Supreme Court. And I don't doubt that she'll do a good job.
Just a reminder to the students in the Zoom, you can start submitting your questions at the Q&A tab at the bottom. We're going to get to your questions pretty soon, but I do want to talk a little bit, and a couple of you have referenced it already, the election, right? And I want to think about it from a couple of different ways. Number one, and I'll go to the Democrats on the panel first. One of the things that's going to make this confirmation hearing so interesting and unique is that the Democratic vice presidential nominee will be sitting on the Judiciary Committee and having the chance to interrogate the nominee. Talk to me a little bit about what you think Senator Harris may do and how that sort of plays into the broader Biden campaign strategy and messaging around this.
So yeah, this will be a very interesting situation, because I've heard a lot of people, I'm on coalition calls a lot, and meaning a lot of activists on the outside that are trying to plan how to influence the proceedings. And a common sentiment that I encounter on these coalition calls is there any way we can get all the other Democrats in the committee to just yield to Senator Harris? Because there's so much confidence in her as a questioner. And unfortunately, one of the bad things is, despite her rank in terms of being the number 2 on the Democratic Party ticket, she's the least senior member on the Democratic side of the dais. So she won't get her turn to speak in the opening statements until late in the afternoon on Monday the 12th. And she'll be the last person on the Democratic side to ask questions, which sort of hurts us in the sense that whatever concessions she extracts or moments that she creates through her questioning will happen late in the day after some of the narrative has already been set based on, unfortunately, our ranking member, Dianne Feinstein, is somebody that has been the subject of political articles. There's a lot of gossip and chatter about lack of confidence among even her own colleagues in the Democratic caucus about, the fact that she's 87 years old. She's one of the more moderate members. So there's a little bit of unrest in the caucus as well as among the activists about how the first opening rounds of questioning is going to go with Dianne Feinstein and Pat Leahy and some of the older members of the caucus leading the questioning. And so there's a lot of anxiety for people to hurry up and get to Kamala Harris. A lot of the biggest moments that helped set her up and raise her national profile were questionings of Jeff Sessions when he was Attorney General, Bill Barr. So she sort of made a name for herself as a prosecutor's prosecutor up on the dais. The last thing I'll say on this is, if you'll recall, some of these same tensions about Dianne Feinstein sort of being reserved in her approach also bubbled to the surface in the lead up to the Kavanaugh hearings. And you saw that spill out into public view because as soon as Chuck Grassley gavelled the hearing to order on the very first day of the Kavanaugh hearings, this was even before Christine Blasey Ford came forward with her allegations. Senator Harris took the lead of just interrupting, calling the hearings illegitimate, asking for them to be delayed until after all the documents were produced, because there was a huge controversy over certain documents still sitting at the National Archives. And then a bunch of other Democrats followed her lead. Cory Booker, Amy Klobuchar all jumped in. Dianne Feinstein was not on board with that as a tactic. It was discussed in advance. She did not ratify it. And so it was sort of Kamala Harris taking it upon herself to do that. Now that she's the number 2 on the ticket, I'm not sure that the Biden campaign will give her the free rein to sort of, carry out those same type of tactics. So it'll be interesting to see how she plays it now that she's not just responsible to herself and her own Senate office, but to the larger campaign structure.
Staying on the Democratic side for a moment, the conventional wisdom, right? Like all the pundits, all of our friends on cable news, that when the first political conversations after Justice Ginsburg's death began, the rush was, oh my gosh, this is the game changer. This is the thing that could scramble the narrative, and this is comfortable territory for Republicans. First of all, if I had $1 for every time someone said something this year was a game changer in the campaign, right? Like it would be a very different thing. But I am curious how you see the Biden campaign. One of the things I find interesting is they're not focused on the process, right? Complaining about the hypocrisy, as some Democrats would say, of McConnell. They're not focused as much, they still are, but not as much on Roe v. Wade as their leading talking point as they typically would be in a Supreme Court fight. They're focusing on other things. They're focusing on the Affordable Care Act. Talk a little bit about what that says about how the Biden campaign sees it as an electoral issue.
So typically, the reason why the activists and politicos said it was a game changer because normally a Supreme Court battle is really useful in driving out the Republican base. It is something that is more motivating to them than it is to the Democratic base. That has flipped now based on the data that we see internally and the public polls in terms of the intensity around this. Democrats are worked up about it, upwards of almost 2-to-1 compared to Republicans. It's a real flip of what it normally is. That being said, as Brian mentioned, the overwhelming majority of voters on both sides believe that this should be delayed after the election. Now, that being said, process arguments, while they poll well, they are not motivators for voters. Nobody believes you should game the system or rig the system or break the rules to get something done. But that's sort of already baked in of what they think about these politicians anyway. And what is more persuasive is the human impact of this choice. Now, as Brian said, it's unlikely that Democrats can do anything to block this. We might be able to delay it a little bit past the election, which, depending upon the results of the election, it could change the dynamic of this. And I think the Biden campaign realizes that. So rather than talking about the process, they are talking about the human impact, which is the Affordable Care Act. Right after the election, the Supreme Court will hear oral arguments in a case of some Republican states suing to overturn the Affordable Care Act. And if she is voted on and installed on the court, she will be sitting there hearing that argument. She has some writings and other evidence that she's in favor of overturning it. She was critical of what John Roberts did the last time it came to the court to preserve the law. So it is much more impactful to talk about, if she is confirmed if Donald Trump gets his way in jamming this nomination through so close to the election, then he is one more vote closer to overturning the Affordable Care Act. The Trump administration is a signatory to this case before the Supreme Court. So that is primarily what Joe Biden is talking about, the impact on the Affordable Care Act, the impact on taking away 100 million people's protections against discrimination for pre-existing conditions, or making pregnancy a pre-existing condition again, the impact of undoing that law. And politically, it's a safer territory to be in, knowing that we can't block this nominee. We don't have any tools in our toolbox to do that. So don't set that expectation, but make Republicans own the fact that they want this person on the court to overturn the law.
So let's turn to the Republicans in the Trump campaign and sort of how they think this impacts their campaign. Do they think that this is going to mobilize their base? Do they think this is the kind of distraction they wanted from COVID? Talk a little bit about that. And then I'd also love to hear you sort of your take on the point Brian was making earlier about the down ballot impact, where he was talking about how he thinks, and the Senate Democrats think, that this actually helps them in Senate races. How do you think it works in some of those competitive Senate races? So Ron and Antonia?
Sure. I'm just going to start with something. Right after, a few days after Justice Ginsburg passed away, I contacted Amy Walter, who most folks know. If you don't know, she's the national editor of the Cook Political Report. She's incredibly smart. I think she's probably the smartest political analyst there is out there. And I asked her what her take was. And she said, paraphrasing, that given this whole year, a pandemic, we had a presidential impeachment, we have had wildfires, we have had race riots across the country, we have had police brutality, we've had so many massive issues, and the president's poll numbers and the Vice President Biden's poll numbers have stayed almost exactly the same. Now, could they switch, a bit on the margins? Maybe. And, I know that Brian and Stephanie have cited some polls, but her overall take, and just looking at some of the polling, they're still not moving. And then you had last night's interesting presidential debate, or not very presidential debate. And I just don't know how much more noise people can feel and experience. Now, for the activists, and Brian works with a lot of activists on the left, I appreciate they're activated. I just don't know, given how much exhaustion there is in America, how much more this is really going to impact. Now, to down ballot, yes, I think on the margin, some of these races, it could, for it hurting some Republicans and helping some Republicans. And to Stephanie's point, yes, she's 100% right. The court has always been a very important issue for conservatives. As just a point of fact, in 2016, we monitored the Democratic National Convention, and I do not believe, I'm going to have my number wrong, I don't even think Merrick Garland's name was really cited at all. And this was a huge motivator on the right. So I guess my overall sense is yes. From Brian's position, this is now the left understands the importance of the judiciary more. Republicans and conservatives have just a different understanding and appreciation for what the court should or shouldn't do. I mean that not as a critique, it's just we have different views of what the role of the court is in society, and that's fine. We don't like the judicial branch to be a super legislature. We think that should be with elected officials, though sometimes elected officials certainly are questionable. But overall, it's, if now from Brian's perspective, people understand the importance of the court to the left, then it's going to mirroring where the right has been. That's fine. I just don't think that I cannot see, given how much the American people have gone through in 2020, that how much more they can actually take. And as a point of fact, I think, to quote Amy Walter again, she tweeted last night that's like that 50% of independents turned off the debate after 30 minutes. So I don't know. I think on the margins down ballot, and for the Trump campaign, which was your initial question, Mo, if it helps turn out base voters, sure. But I think those base voters, Trump voters, love Trump. I can't see how this gets more of those people out. And to Stephanie's point, talking about healthcare is never a great thing for Republicans. But I have plenty of answers to all of that about the case before the Supreme Court. But I'll turn to Ron.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that the Trump campaign, any day that they're talking about something else besides COVID, is a good day for them. So having this process take place and having people follow it is really important. Additionally, while I think the base voters for Trump are there, they're not going anywhere, they're going to come out to vote. There are a number of Republicans who have been on the fence about whether or not they were going to support Trump, and they were considering and have been considering supporting Biden. A Supreme Court nomination unites the Republican Party. It is it's like the one thing that is the fabric woven in our ideology. Many Republicans who might have thought about voting for Biden will likely vote for Trump because they would like to have another member of the Supreme Court, another one of Trump's nominees on the bench. That's something that's obviously a plus for the Trump camp. Obviously, anything can happen in this environment. You're 30-some days before the election. We could have bombshells go off regarding Barrett's nomination, some opposition research that happens to appear a day before the Judicial Committee hearing. You just really don't know. But I do think overall it energizes those Republicans that are on the fence and unsure what to do with themselves. I agree with Antonia that this is going to turn out some voters in some states and to help some vulnerable senators, Republicans, and may not be helpful in some other states. I'm going to decline naming those states today. But anyway, I'll turn it back over to you, Mo.
So before we start taking questions from the audience, I kind of want to put each side in the hot seat for 1 second. Brian and Stephanie, last night, and this is sort of on the politics of the issue of judicial, court reform. I was on Fox News this morning, and I was getting hammered by questions about why Joe Biden tied himself in knots when he got the question about the filibuster reform or about court packing. And so maybe you can each talk for a moment about sort of where the party's head is on that and how that might impact the conversation leading into the election.
There's long been support for reforms to the Supreme Court process to make it more balanced, but also, for either side to get more of their seats on. Whether it's expanding the court by 2 seats, or the move to make DC or Puerto Rico a state, so that there are 2 more additional senators, or 4 if we get both of those done. There's a number of different reforms. At the same time, Biden is an institutionalist. He's a believer in Senate rules. And I think that he is worried that if you start adding 2 seats to solve your problem when you're not in power, the people in power will add 2 seats to solve their problem. And it becomes a spiral that is really bad for democracy. I think that is his primary problem. His secondary problem is that, he's running, I wouldn't say he's running as a moderate, he's running as Joe Biden. And reflective of, the big tent, imagery of the Democratic Party. And these court reforms, I'm not making a personal judgment on it, but politically, some might call them radical and supportive by the far left. And that's not how he's running. And he knows that this close to the election, supporting something like that could create some road bumps for, you know, the small sliver of people out there who have yet to make a decision. They are persuadable targets for the Biden campaign right now. They are not Democrats. They are independents and probably Obama-Trump voters. So he's trying to walk a line, both based on his personal beliefs about the institution and not piss off the progressive wing of the party, but not alienate the persuasives either.
Brian, do you want to add in anything on that?
Yeah, I would just take a step back and say that this is separate from the issues that I think any Democrats from Joe Biden on down are planning to contest the election on. But I do think that is a subject of increased chatter among thinkers, influencers, columnists, people in the outside advocacy community, that at some point there needs to be a push to try to restore a sense of democracy. I think that it's now it seems to become the rule rather than the exception for the Electoral College system to produce presidents that did not win the popular vote. And we're all conditioned now from Nate Silver and Nate Cohn's analysis to think that it's not enough for Biden to just win the popular vote by 3 points because of, you know, how the vote may be sorted across different states. And so he's got to win by like 5 or 6 points to be guaranteed of, you know, actually being the president. And then you have a system in the Senate, which we've all gotten accustomed to for many years. I worked in the Senate for 6 years, Stephanie did too. And we're all conditioned to the practice of each state gets 2 senators, regardless of how big or small you are, term called malapportionment. And what that tends to produce is, you know, have 2 out of the last 3 presidents that in the first instance were elected without winning the popular vote, that are nominating justices to the Supreme Court that are then confirmed by Republican majorities that represent a minority of the population. And so there's a budding sense among people that institutions like the Electoral College, institutions like the way that the Senate is set up, plus the filibuster rule on top of that, creates all these counter-majoritarian features of our democracy that has led to what some might call a tyranny of the minority. You know, we want to avoid tyranny of the majority, but in some senses, a lot of people are starting to think we might have tyranny of the minority. So there is a huge push for reforms, for ideas like getting rid of the filibuster if Democrats win 3-way control. And I'm sure that, you know, people like Antonio will disagree with that and warn, and Mitch McConnell's already been on the Senate floor warning Democrats against that. But, you know, Mitch in 2009 famously gave an interview to Carl Hulse of the New York Times, who's a friend to all of us, bragging about the fact that their strategy quite openly was to prevent any cooperation from Barack Obama. And so a lot of us feel like we'd be suckers if we let McConnell pull off that same strategy and, you know, submitted to that for the first 2 years of Joe Biden's presidency. And so a lot of us are trying to build up the political will. It does not yet exist uniformly across the Democratic caucus. It does not exist in the mind of Joe Biden. But I do think we crossed a big threshold when Barack Obama stood up at John Lewis's funeral and in his eulogy basically called for Democrats to put these options on the table.
Can I interject one quick thing? You know, abortion rights is a very important issue. It doesn't matter where you are on the spectrum. I would just note the following. Sennett Democrats have filibustered, used the legislative filibuster to block a lot of pro-life legislation. Now, sort of inferring from what Stephanie said, there are traditions when you have a midterm where chambers flip. It's just historically what happens. The party of the presidency typically loses a chamber, and that's what we saw that under President Obama. I don't know why, if you are for abortion rights, why you want to hand Republicans down the road the ability to just ram through pro-life legislation. So I understand what President Obama said. I'm just saying, if you're on the other side, be careful what you give, because you're in power one time, you're going to lose power again. That always happens. Be careful what you wish for.
All right, we're going to go to student questions in 1 second, I promise. But I do want to ask, and sort of this piggybacks off of Antonia's point about chambers flipping, right? I mean, there's a pretty good chance, there's at least a decent chance that Democrats take control of the Senate. If, based on some of the things Brian was talking about earlier, in terms of the movements that Senate Democrats are going to try to at least delay this, if they are able to pull this out of the air and delay it till after the election, and Republicans have lost the chamber, does that change Mitch McConnell's calculus, or does it change the calculus of any of the members of the Republican caucus?
I don't think so. I think that, if Senate Republicans lost the majority at the that they would still move on confirming Barrett. I don't think there would be any delay at all. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. No.
Yeah. Yes.
Because if they're now, the keys are going to be handed to, the majority are going to be handed to the Democrats in January. Absolutely. They're going to get it done as soon as possible. And especially if Mark Kelly wins in Arizona and is seated November 30th, they're going to get it done before that. Absolutely.
The only caveat that I would put on Ron's comment, and I agree with what Ron is saying, they're still likely to get it done, is that if something comes out of her hearing or something is revealed that makes some Republicans think twice, like if Susan Collins loses, will she finally vote against one of these guys or one of this nominee based on something that comes out of the hearing? Of course, we would need 4 Republicans to vote with us. Getting 4 would be a very difficult task. I could see maybe getting 2, but getting 4 will be difficult. If it's a senator who has lost their seat and doesn't feel like they need to be in lockstep with the majority leader anymore, they may feel more free to do what they want. But based on what we know right now, that's unlikely. It will depend on what comes out of those hearings.
I would agree with that. The Senate is on nitroglycerin right now. Anything can occur, really.
Okay. All right. Let's bring in our first student question. When I call on you, please tell us who you are, your school year or Georgetown affiliation, where you're Zooming in from, and then your question. So let's start with Megan.
Hi, my name is Megan Rudolph. I'm a graduate student in the College of Nursing and Health Sciences, calling in from DC. And my question is, do you think that given Judge Barrett's image as a Catholic and a mom of 7, do you think that will help the Trump campaign earn votes of white suburban women?
Ron unmuted himself first.
Well, I unmuted myself to give it to Antonia. But I can say, I'll just jump in and say, I think that that it doesn't hurt. I think it can help, women in the suburbs that Trump desperately needs to improve his chances. Absolutely. The issue of reproductive rights is going to be front and center, and there's going to be some women who are not going to agree with this at all. But she has projected her as an image of a wholesome family, of a very intelligent person that is able to manage a family and do her job at the same time. I think that scores a lot of points. But I would turn it over to anybody else in the group.
I think it's possible, but I think if a suburban woman is not voting for Trump, it's for other reasons, and which we don't need to go into here. But I'm not sure Amy Comey, the nominee, will be enough to convince them to come back to Trump. He's currently losing suburban women.
Okay, thanks so much for the question, Megan. Next up, we've got Ruth.
Hi, my name is Ruth. I'm actually a staff member at Georgetown University. I work for the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And my question sort of builds on some of the things that you were already talking about, but it's, are there any judicial or institutional reforms that you think both the Senate Republicans and the Democrats could agree upon?
If the question is over length of a Supreme Court justice being in office, I mean, it's a lifetime appointment. I don't know how that would happen. It seems very difficult for me to see that in terms of court packing, or that's what we would call it on the Republican side, or adding additional seats. I do not foresee many Republicans being supportive of that, and I think there would be just a continued escalation. So I wouldn't call them reforms. It's like something used to bother me with the Affordable Care Act. It was health reform. God bless you Democrats for convincing everyone it was reform. It was fine. I have no problem with it. I'm just saying, I'm not sure I'd call it reform, but I don't think there's much common ground to be found.
Brian, in your work on these issues, have you seen anything that Republicans might be attracted to?
Term limits. Term limits pretty much polls well in any context. The public supports term limits for lawmakers in Congress. The public supports term limits for Supreme Court justices. It pretty consistently polls upwards of 70%. There is a theory of a way. Ro Khanna recently just introduced a bill in the House calling for 18-year term limits for Supreme Court justices. And the theory of how you could legislate this and not require a constitutional amendment, notwithstanding that the Constitution confers lifetime tenure on federal judges, is the theory is that if you got confirmed to the Supreme Court, you would serve for 18 years there, and then you would either achieve senior status, which exists right now in the federal judiciary, where you sort of have a part-time job, so you're still able to hear cases, but sort of at a reduced capacity, or you would roll off the Supreme Court and ride circuit or sit on a circuit court of appeals. And so the Constitution says that you're guaranteed lifetime tenure. It doesn't necessarily say that you're guaranteed to serve for life on any particular court. That's not to say that there wouldn't be legal challenges, and this Supreme Court probably would not greet kindly an attempt to term limit itself, but as the theory of how you might be able to legislate that. And term limits is an idea that has had bipartisan support from brand people. John Roberts, when he was a Justice Department official in the Reagan administration, actually wrote a memo inside the Justice Department suggesting that the Reagan administration should come out in favor of term limits for Supreme Court justices. So a group like mine supports it, but we don't think that it's enough. But it could be something that if I succeed in getting increased chatter about adding seats, maybe Republicans will downcheck and settle for term limits as some kind of meet in the middle solution.
Right. Thanks for the question, Ruth. Let's go to Kelvin, who was selected primarily for his excellent choice of t-shirts today.
Hello, my name is Kelvin. I am a sophomore in the college studying political economy, and I'm zooming in from Houston, Texas. And my question, this is kind of a basic question, but what are the steps in the confirmation process, and what steps will be significantly affected by the unprecedented speed of Barrett's confirmation?
Kelvin showing me up as moderator by asking the question I should have started with. Who wants to take this?
So, okay, well, just quickly, and Stephanie, if I miss anything, please check me here. So what do we have? We have the nominee is announced. We have a nominee, Amy Coney Barrett. We have the questionnaire from the Judiciary Committee. Check, that's been done and submitted to the Senate. We have courtesy visits, which are taking place right now. You have prep from the nominee for Judge Barrett is going through right now for the hearings. The committee is preparing on both sides how they're going to prepare, Republicans and Democrats, opening statements. They're going through extensive research, looking through everything that they need to sort of think about in terms of questions, et cetera. They're coming up with their arguments. So check there. We'll have the hearings begin. When did they begin again? I was going to forget the date. The 14th?
October 12th.
October the 12th. Okay, October the 12th, the hearings begin. And they typically take all week long. So we will have all week long. Traditionally, they're in this huge Hart office building room. It will be very different than it was with Kavanaugh, where friends of Brian's went in and were very, very distracting during the first part of the Kavanaugh hearings. That will be severely restricted because of COVID. Then the nominee will be reported out. They have a funny little jinky rule in the Judiciary Committee where they can hold over the nominee a little bit, so there's a little bit of a delay. So then you sort of have the last week before the election. Her nomination, Judge Barrett's nomination, will be on the floor. It typically takes a week, and so by the end of that week, you will have a confirmed. This is if everything goes to plan, and again, per Stephanie and Brian, things could get a little jinky there, but I don't expect it to, and so you very well could have a confirmed nominee the week before the election. Did I miss anything?
Okay.
I think you get an A for that. That was incredible, Antonia. Great work. Now do it backwards.
Thanks, Kelvin, for the question. We're coming up on the end of our time, and I know our panelists need to jump right on time. So I think we're going to end it there with the questions. But I kind of want to end with a comment, if I could. Our politics around the Supreme Court have gotten incredibly visceral and hot. In the fight to replace Justice Scalia, and now the fight to replace Justice Ginsburg. And I think as we reflect on that, it's important to remember that those two justices, who could not have been more different and who argued like crazy over the cases before them, were also the best of friends. And the stories about their personal relationship and regard for one another and genuine friendship are legendary. And I, for one, hope, the stakes are high in these court cases. It's understandable why the politics get so hot, but I, for one, hope that at some point our politics can live up to the legacy of their friendship. So with that, this conversation was a good start. And I want to thank Stephanie, Brian, Ron, and Antonia for coming in and having a very deep and conversation where we saw the differences, but based in respect. That's kind of what we try to do here at GU Politics. For the audience, thank you for sharing your time with us tonight. Keep an eye out. We've got some other upcoming events next week. We're going to be doing an event on covering 2020 with a handful of political journalists. We're going to try to make sense of how they try to make sense of this crazy time. And we've got a few other things that we're going to be announcing shortly as well. So please continue to follow us at GU Politics for updates on what we've got coming up. And with that, thank you all. Have a good night.